you like, peacekeeping or nation building, which of course is where we're at now. That was partly driven by wanting to be seen to be engaged in work that was important to the US and to the alliance, and important work for the soldiers to be doing. But I think it was also driven by a belief that other kinds of work was going to be more dangerous, risk more casualties, and therefore have a greater political implication for the government as well. Some might say I'm too cynical, but... So they went back in 2005, and we've seen various versions of that strategy unfolding ever since. My view is that the mission has kind of changed a bit. You know, at the beginning, that first mission was get rid of the Taliban and oust Al-Qaeda or dismantle Al-Qaeda. And then now it's sort of become make sure Afghanistan is no longer, a haven for terrorists, I think is the phrase that we hear. And, you know, if we can rebuild the country and girls can go to school, that's really great as well. If you talk to someone like Alexander Downer, he describes it as mission creep. There are others who don't like that phrase, but that the mission had kept on changing, and there's plenty of criticism about whether or not people had or have a clear understanding of what was trying to be achieved there. So in writing my book, I've tried to chronologue all of that. I've also noted the death of every Australian soldier, because mercifully there are few enough of them that you can do that, and it also helps to show you the way the debate has unfolded. The only one whose death thus far is not in the book is Private Matthew Lambert, who died in August when I was actually in Afghanistan, so we'd finished the book by then. I've tried not to tell people what to think. I have a very strong view that people are smart enough to make up their own minds, and so what I've tried to do is present as clear a picture of the good, the bad and the ugly as I could assemble with the assistance of people who were involved. And a lot of the people who spoke to me are not acknowledged and didn't speak to me. They spoke to me on a background basis. Because I want people to have a sense of how we got through this process to where we are, all the things that flowed from September 11, and then the last chapter in my book talks about, gathers their views, the ones on the record, of where we've come from, where we are now and where we're headed. And I hope that people will be able to make a judgment about the conflict thus far and about what should come next on the basis of that. So the two conclusions I guess I draw are that we haven't debated this enough, and we have a tendency these days to not debate, and I think we should, and I think we should sooner than we have. There's often an opinion put from government that it's dangerous to debate such matters when the operation is still current, and it can be seen as undermining the troops and the morale of the troops. I think we're probably more sophisticated than that. Other people may beg to differ. Some people serving in the Defence Force may differ from that view, but I do think we can debate these things, and we didn't debate it at the beginning. And I also just pose the question of whether we always should say yes to the United States, or whether there are ever circumstances in which we should say no. Now, some people say we should say yes because of the alliance, because we are dependent on the US for its military support of us in this region and generally. Others say there might be circumstances when we could stand up and say we don't think this is in our interests or in your interests. Doesn't seem to happen all that often. So they're the two things that I guess I ask people to think about. I've tried to make this a readable story. The other thing I wanted to do was to make it understandable. I can't stand those turgid books where you pick up and they're worthy and you really feel you need to understand it, but oh my goodness, you can't get past the first chapter. So I hope that people feel that they can understand it. I've woven some of my own personal observations in. To my mother's horror, it starts with a hangover, because it seemed like a good idea at the time. A few of us, very excited at having arrived in Washington those few days before September 11, went out on the night of September 10. And so getting up on September 11 was unpleasant, and the rest of the day was really unpleasant. So, you know, I start with that. It's a human story, and in the end, it's the story of people, as war always is. It's people who make the decisions, the people who implement them, and the people who are affected by them, whether they are us here or those people in Afghanistan. And I've tried to cover as much as possible the range of issues that emerge, the treatment of Afghan people, the question of human rights, and the view of the soldiers. I spoke to some ex-SAS guys who went in the very early deployment, and they told some good stories, and some other people told some good stories. There are a couple of funny stories in the book. My favourite, which you may have heard me tell before, but I'll tell quickly now, is that early on in the deployment of the Special Forces, they were doing, among other things, surveillance, and Afghanistan, for anyone who's not been there, is an incredibly stark country. In the province that they were in, there was not a lot to hide behind. So they were doing their best to hide and conduct their surveillance. And they kept getting busted by herds of goats because the goats are very curious and they're also very stealthy. I got snuck up on by a herd of goats. They're very quiet and nimble. And the goats were busting the soldiers, and the goats always have a goat herd, and so the goats would come over and the soldiers would say, the goat herd would say, "What are you looking at?" And their cover was blown. So this is an absolutely dead set true story. The soldiers came back to Canberra and said, "We need a goat repellent." Because the goats are finding us all the time. And so there became, I swear this is true, a top secret project through Defence Science to find a goat repellent. And somehow they discovered that goats are afraid of tigers. Now, never mind, there are no tigers in Afghanistan anymore. Apparently goats remember that they are afraid of tigers. But there aren't any tigers in the wild in Australia either. So picture this, defence scientists visiting Australian zoos, collecting tiger excrement to make a goat repellent. And it was quite effective, and the goats were stampeding away, and the goat herds were going, "What are you running away from?" And sorry, I just knocked that. And so they still hadn't solved their problem. So I haven't managed to find out what the attractant was, but they then went and researched an attractant to neutralise the repellent, came up with a formula that neither attracted nor repelled, and it worked. It's a nice image. It's hard to know who enjoyed it more, the soldiers thinking of the scientists crawling around tiger cages knee deep in tiger do, or the scientists thinking of the soldiers having to spray it all over themselves. But either way, it was pretty good, and I make the point that somebody made to me in the book that apparently the scientists bought a herd of goats to test all of this on, Afghan goats, and then they sold it, and actually sold them for more than they paid for them. So the person who told me the story said, "Isn't it good to know that when defence is knee-deep in shit, it can make a profit out of something?" That was my favourite story from the book. There are others, but so, even in war, things are not all terrible and doom and gloom. I'll keep an eye on the time. I'll just quickly tell you, my recent trip to Afghanistan was on an embed with the Defence Force, which for some people is controversial because it's naturally a compromise. If you opt to go and look at the war from the point of view of one side or other, then you're a bit beholden to them, and certainly I was beholden for my security, and they assisted me in organising interviews that I wanted and taking places I wanted to go. To give Defence credit though, they have changed their attitude to access, and they're not doing that paranoid control thing that they used to do. And so I was able to go and see and speak to everything and everyone that I wanted to, and they facilitated some pretty good interviews with people that otherwise they would not have let us anywhere near. My colleague Jeff Kell, the cameraman, and I went to Tarankot at the big base there, and then we travelled both into the town and then up the Chora Road, which is a newly tarred road between Tarankot and Chora, to the Mirrawais base, which is right up in the middle of the Chora Valley, which is sort of up in the guts of Uruzgan province. And we went through the Baluchi Valley as well, both of which have been quite violent, and certainly Australian soldiers have lost their lives there, and there's been a lot of unrest which has also killed a lot of Afghans. We went on foot patrol with the soldiers, which is a character-forming experience when you are looking at every step you take and wondering what you're going to tread on. You're looking at every person, wondering if they've got something attached to them. You're looking at every car, you're looking on every roof and down every alley. It's a tough job that they do. Whatever you think about going to the war, it is a tough job. It was a pretty remarkable experience for us. I was able to speak to some Afghan tribal leaders and Afghan army officers. I came away with very mixed views about the so-called success of progress that's been made. I can understand the soldiers on the ground saying that they feel that they are making progress, and there is visible development. As I said, the tarred road, it does have an impact because it means people can travel from place to place more easily. They can take their goods to market, so commerce flows better, which brings the price of things in a place like Chora down. It used to take 4 days in some cases, or days to get up and down those valleys. Now you can do it in a very short time and a matter of hours to get all the way up and back again. So it has affected commerce, it's affected the local economy, and it's made things more affordable for people. So I can understand the arguments about progress. Similarly, there is training of the Afghan forces. They are feeling like they're getting a grip on some parts of security in some parts of the province. But when you talk to them, they also say they're very worried about the transition. They're worried about the withdrawal. They are being trained to fight with helicopters and artillery and all sorts of things that go bang, and they're not going to have those when everybody leaves. So they're worried about that. A lot of the local people, as I say, going is a compromise, so I wasn't speaking to ordinary local people, I was speaking to people that had been arranged for me. Some of them had criticisms about the way aid was being handed out. There is quite obviously still a lot of tribal warfare and just village to village unrest and grabbing for resources that impacts on the sorts of things that coalition forces do there, because you become part of the organism. If you're contributing development money into a situation, sometimes development money can cause harm as well as good. It can create conflict as well. So there's good there, there's bad there. It's quite clear to me that we need to withdraw, and there are people that will talk to you about how long that should take. And I guess the question really is, of course we need to ultimately withdraw. It's how fast we do it, it's the manner that it's executed in, and it's what's left behind that are the big questions. And there are a range of views on those matters. I've spoken with people who think that people should just leave immediately, and I was on a panel in Melbourne with Malala Joya, who's for whom I've got a great deal of respect, who's a former Afghan parliamentarian, female parliamentarian, who believes that everyone should just get out and they could fix it all by themselves. And it's impossible to know if that's the truth or not. I defer to her as a local person in her views, but I also get the distinct impression from being in one tiny corner of Afghanistan that there are different corners of Afghanistan, and this is not a country that is really nationally governed, despite having a national government. It's got a feudal history, and that feudalism continues, and that poses a huge challenge not only for those of the Defence Force and allies who are there now, but for the local people to manage into the future. One of the interesting things, I spoke to the US Colonel who's in charge of the Afghan deployment, and he was sort of outlining what are basically 4 different groups of people that are engaging in violence in Afghanistan at the moment. One of them is, I guess, the insurgents with a sort of national agenda who may want to bring down the national government and take over nationally again. Some, they insist there is still a kind of global insurgency. I didn't see evidence of it, but I wouldn't necessarily on the short visit that I had. But they insist there are still people with a global agenda who want to execute a similar September 11 style attack. But then there's just ordinary criminal behaviour, crime that has went on before and will go on into the future. And there's also this tribal feudalism. And unfortunately, they all use the same methods. They all shoot and they all blow each other up. And when you ask, the Americans or the Australians, well, how can you tell who's who? They say, we can't. So they're dealing with issues that existed long before they got there and will exist long after they're gone. And they are trying to build a community that is able to manage it on its own. I guess the danger is that you walk out and leave a place that's in a worse condition than when you found it, and that's certainly what the soldiers on the ground don't want to do, and I don't think any of us want to do that. Managing the exit is going to be the big question. So I'll probably finish there, and let's have a conversation about it.
Thanks, Karen. So while you have a quick sip of your beer, I'll ask you the first question and give people time to think about what they want to ask. I rather stumbled on the difficulties Karen's faced by putting something up on my Facebook page yesterday saying, oh, Karen's talking at politics in the pub, why don't you come along? And let's just say there was some rather heated misinformation,
views, opinions.
Views. No, in terms of misinterpretations of what you'd said, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think to combine that with, the first thing, or one of the first things you said tonight about, look, John Howard made the decision to go to war there and then. For him, that was clearly a personal decision. We had sort of conversations about evidence-based policy and all that sort of stuff, but in a nutshell, that's a political decision. Yep. In that instance, a political decision made by a person in a time of incredible stress. Not him personally, but that's that he may have felt stressed, but that was a rather unusual situation for a Prime Minister to be in to make that decision. So I guess my question to you is, if we are going to have a debate as a society